Chapter 20. Sunday late afternoon. The walk up the creek was pleasant until Doreen got to where she always crossed over to Penny's side. And then she got melancholic and said, "Just think. If Penny hadn't attacked me," she said out loud, "or if she hadn't shot Hornby." She was pretty sure the jury would let Penny off the hook on killing her brother on compassionate grounds alone, since she had been through a similar sort of abuse as her brother. But those recent attacks on Hornby and Doreen? Those were an entirely different thing. With her hands in her pockets, Doreen walked forward past the stepping stones, wanting to cross over to see how Penny's garden looked, but knowing she was here for an entirely different reason. She had never been up this far either. She kept on walking as the creek lost some of its bank, making the traveling a little difficult. But with the water still low, she could walk along the creek bed itself. She just didn't want to end up falling and hurting her ankle, and having to call for help. That would be humiliating. Some of the creek up here had really high banks, and she knew that some of them were private property, but along one side was a large pathway. She should have crossed over when she could to remain on the safer path. Bridges, overpasses, and underpasses allowed for the walkway on one side. But of course, she wasn't on that side. She kept on walking farther, recognizing some of the landmarks she'd seen on her Google search, and then finally she came to the corner where it looked like Steve's property started. Immaculate lawns spread out in front of her. She could still continue to walk on the rocks and not touch his private property. As far as water rights went in Canada, you didn't own the water. There were the odd properties that had different rules written into ownership, but that would have been older archaic rules. Along here was a riparian zone, and you owned up to the high water mark, but once you got to a high water mark, the city owned that and controlled what you could do with your land before it too. So she was allowed to walk where she was. It was Crown land. She kept going, only to realize Thaddeus had fallen behind. She walked back and offered him her shoulder. He hopped up, crooned against her, and tucked up along her neck. He was seated but staring up and around avidly. "We've never been here before, have we?" she asked. "It's new." "It's new." "It is indeed new," she said with a chuckle. Calling Goliath to her, they kept walking until they got to the end of Steve's property. It was a stunning location. It opened up to more farmland, horse pastures, and what looked like a big riding arena in the distance. Up and down, the path had disappeared somewhere along the line, but she figured that, from the looks of the worn paths she was on now, this was an area people used when the water was low. She was probably allowed to walk along the grassy edge, but she didn't want him to see her. It was certainly easy to see that big money had bought this property, unlike Nan's home, with its rough gardens and overgrown backyard. This place was so perfect she knew Steve had full-time gardeners and landscapers to make sure everything was tickety-boo. She knew it because it was exactly what she'd had before when married. As soon as she passed his property, she climbed up the bank onto the real path and kept going. At least he wouldn't see her here. All she'd really learned was that he had a beautiful, expensive place, and that he hadn't suffered by handing out money. But maybe if the biker gang realized Steve had something to say, or that Doreen had something to say about his activities, that might change things. She wandered down, hearing running footsteps behind her. She turned, wondering who it was. Then, frowning, she slipped off to the side and took the stepping stones across to Penny's corner. If the water rose much more, she wouldn't get across easily. And for Goliath, it would be traumatizing. She stopped midstream to look back to see him meowing at her. She returned, picked him up, and not even trying to stay dry, walked through the current to the other side. She just made it to the treed area on the other side, when she turned to see who was coming. A man ran past where she'd been. And sure enough, it was Steve. She stood, frowning. Had he seen her at his property? And then she realized that while she was here, he could be heading to her house. On that note, she dashed back across the creek to her side carrying Goliath, her heart racing with the realization she had once again not set the alarms, and all that paperwork was there. She saw no sign of Steve anywhere. As she came around the corner, dashing up to her house, she wasn't sure if she was relieved or not. Until she got inside and made sure everything was still here and safe, she had no way to know. She raced inside the kitchen door only to hear the door out front slam shut. Muggs barked, and she went through the house to the front door. There was no sign of anyone now. Of course. Where was the media busy taking photos when she needed them? She ran back to the kitchen door, worried he'd come around the side. But as she went around the side toward the garage, she saw somebody disappear over the fence. She called out, "It's all digital." At that, he tripped and missed a step, but kept on going. "It's all right, Steve. I've already handed it all over too." But he didn't stop. And she didn't know what else to do. She headed back into the kitchen. Sure enough, the physical folder with his name was gone. The clipped pieces she had removed from the file were still here, face down, but not the folder itself. It was a good thing she'd scanned everything. But she'd wanted to keep all the paper copies too.